Good afternoon. This is Catherine Klein with the National Regulatory Research Institute. Welcome to NRRI's May webinar on Delinquencies and Disconnections, Case Studies from the States. So this webinar is the second in our series, and it's hosted by the NARUC Committee on Consumers and the Public Interest and the National Association of State Utility Consumer Advocates in collaboration with the National Regulatory Research Institute. The focus of this series is data collection for utility disconnections and delinquencies. And the purpose is to gain a greater understanding of the utility and state agency data collection processes around the country for a future recommendation on consistent data collection and reporting models. For today's webinar, which is the second in the series, we're going to focus on providing some insights and perspectives from states that are successfully implementing data collection processes that are helping to improve outcomes relating to utility delinquencies and disconnections. This webinar provides a forum for PUC staff with experience with successful data collection efforts to report on the genesis of and stakeholder participation in their processes, to share what the processes entail, and to discuss areas for continued improvement. Experts on utility disconnections have been invited to provide comments and participate in a joint dialogue on trends observed in this field over the past decade. Before we jump in, I'd like to provide a couple of housekeeping points. If you have a question that you'd like to ask, please use the questions box on your GoToMeetings toolbar and submit questions there. The intention of this webinar is to allow participants to engage with the panelists through question boxes, so please take full advantage of this tool. Our plan is to allow panelists to field questions after every section, and Commissioner Gold is going to handle this effort. Finally, I'd like to introduce our moderator for today's panel, and that would be the Honorable Marian S. Gold, PhD, and she's a commissioner for the Rhode Island Public Utilities Commission. Commissioner Gold was appointed to the Rhode Island PUC by Governor Gina Raimondo in June of 2016. Commissioner Gold has previously served as a commissioner on the Rhode Island Office of Energy Resources. Prior to joining OER, she was the director of the Extension Center at the University of Rhode Island, where she established the URI Partnership for Energy and directed energy education programs. Marian serves on the boards of the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative and the National Regulatory Research Institute. And she's also a member of the NARUC Committee on Electricity, so she's very busy. She holds a PhD in Environmental Sciences from the University of Rhode Island and a BS from the University of Michigan and an MS from Michigan State University. Thank you so much for joining us today, Commissioner Gold, and please take it away.
Great. Thanks so much, Catherine. It's great to be here. I feel a little badly. I think my bio is longer than everyone else's, so it was nice of you to read that. Welcome to the webinar. I'm really excited to be back moderating the second in this four-part series. By the end of the webinar series, we hope to have some focused recommendations for best practices for the regulatory community. How can we move towards more consistent data collection and reporting models that we can use to improve outcomes related to utility terminations and uncollectibles. So just briefly, we had one other webinar in May, and in that webinar we looked at the status of the problem. We learned that despite many programs and services and working on this problem for many years, terminations and uncollectibles continue to be a problem across the country, and I think we'll talk a little bit more about that today. For example, we found out that in Connecticut, a whopping 20% of the residential customer base is behind on their bills. We took a look at some of the reasons behind this problem. It's partly a function of rising costs as we upgrade utility infrastructure, try to have a cleaner energy system and a modern energy system. And it's partly a function of some unintended consequences, well-intended programs which have resulted in unsustainably high bills, growing uncollectible accounts, and more terminations. We then discussed how better and more standardized data collection, although not a panacea, might help us monitor progress and improve performance. But it's not easy. Lots of challenges, which may include lack of current data, inconsistencies in terminologies and reporting periods, and differences from utility to utility and from state to state. And then finally, we ended our webinar with a discussion of how emerging technologies may be harnessed to better serve low and moderate income customers. We took an intriguing look at some potential solutions on the horizon, and we'll circle back to that discussion in our next webinar. Today, we're going to continue the conversation by sharing some of our experiences in different states and organizations on data collection. And I want to emphasize, as Catherine said, that any and all questions from the audience are welcome. We're going to be using the input to inform the rest of the series, so please don't hesitate to chime in. We have a great panel with us today. I encourage everyone to look at the longer bios, which are on the NRRI website. So I'll just give brief introductions here. John Howitt is a senior policy analyst with the National Consumer Law Center, where he's worked for over 20 years. At the center, John has managed projects across the country in support of low and moderate income consumers' access to affordable energy and utility services. The Honorable Martha Guzman Aceves has served as a commissioner with the California Public Utilities Commission since 2016. And among many, many other things, she has an interest in water affordability and equitable access to distributed solar. Cynthia Wilson-Frias is the Chief of Legal Services at the Rhode Island Public Utilities Commission. Cindy has been working on matters that involve challenges of utility collection and termination issues since she started her first case at the PUC in 2001. So she's got a lot of experience. And finally, Mary Grant is the Public Water for All campaign director at Food and Water Watch. She oversees campaigns to support universal access to safe water in the United States by promoting responsible and affordable public provision of water and sewer services. So this is an area that is becoming more and more an issue across the country. So I think this is a great opportunity to compare some notes on the water and the electric side of the house. Each of our panelists are going to talk for about 10 or 15 minutes. We will take questions, as Catherine said, at the end of, after each presentation, so don't hesitate to send them in as we go along. And then we'll have some time for discussion at the end. We're going to start with John Howitt. He'll kick things off. So take it away, John.
Thank you so much, Commissioner Gold. I really appreciate the introduction. And the invitation by NASUCA, NARUC, and NRRI to participate in this exercise. I think Commissioner Gold started out clearly laying out that there continue to be problems with respect to home energy security in states across the country, despite a lot of good effort to mitigate those problems. At National Consumer Law Center, where we do focus on low-income law and policy advocacy in a broad range of areas, we think of home energy security as pretty much continuous, reliable, affordable access to essential home energy services. So affordability is a big part of it, but other measures of insecurity, such as keeping your home at an unhealthy temperature or foregoing necessities to pay for home energy bills, experiencing service disconnection notices, those are other indicators of home energy insecurity. And on behalf of our low-income clients, we try to work toward programs and policies to mitigate those problems and to enhance access. We know what the consequences are, and I won't spend time talking about that, but we know that there are dire consequences associated with loss of home energy service or unaffordable service. So as part of our mission at NCLC, we've really been looking at the notion of utility credit and collection reporting. We've looked at this for a number of years now and have long recognized the importance of gathering good data and also the public having access to it. So you're going to, let's see, Chris, who is in, move the slides along? Thank you. Thanks. So very quickly, the national data that we have from the Energy Information Administration demonstrates that on average, lower income households use less home energy on a BTU basis than their higher income counterparts. And this chart clearly shows that in each of the census regions of the country. I would add that this is the Residential Energy Consumption Survey, and unfortunately, while it includes a lot of great data points, we don't get state level data from it, and it only comes out every 4 years. So it's not going to cut the mustard in terms of the objectives that this series is focused on. On the next slide, you see that even though lower income households use less energy at home, the burdens that they experience, and that is the proportion of income dedicated to home energy services, is not surprisingly much higher. Assuming that even though there's less usage, that burden is higher because everyone needs sort of a baseline level of energy just to get by, and we see that the lowest income households in regions across the country devote inordinate amounts of their disposable income just to keep the lights on and the indoor temperature reasonable. On the next slide, we see in terms of another measure of home energy insecurity, we see that in the United States, households with income of less than $20,000 a year, many are in chronic danger of not being able to afford basic necessities because of the cost of home energy service. So the blue bars represent households that report almost every month, foregoing necessities to pay the home energy bill, with red lines being some months and the green bar being 1 or 2 months. But the chronic problem for many households in this country is reflected in this slide. Similarly, on the next slide, we see that there is a racial justice component associated with home energy insecurity problems in the United States. The bars on the left reflect Caucasian-headed households foregoing necessities in the United States to pay for home energy service. And you see African-American-headed households and others experiencing this home energy insecurity symptom, if you will, at a much higher rate. So there's another sort of rationale for collecting information on disconnections, and to the extent we can do it as geographically specific as possible, we may have opportunities going forward to address some of the disparities and inequities that are baked into the current system. So moving along, this is a brief list of objectives associated with collecting this type of information that we've been talking about. We don't want to just create a data collection exercise for data's sake. There really are, they're very real objectives that can be attached to efforts to have utilities do this reporting. And I would add here, it's not surprising that many companies are very reluctant to agree to provide credit and collection data. They view it as a black eye when they're reporting their arrearages and disconnections and on other metrics. I think as proponents of this sort of data, it's important to emphasize the extent to which the purpose of this is not a finger-pointing exercise. The purpose of it is to ensure that public policy, regulatory decision-making, some legislative outcomes are geared toward addressing the problems that many households currently experience in terms of staying connected to the system, and also engaging the effectiveness of existing collection protocols. And so to keep the discussion on the objectives as positive as possible, in my view, is really critical to seeing successful outcomes in having new data reporting protocols adopted. On the next slide, this is apparently a little bit of a repeat. On the last webinar, there was a list of credit and collection data points that are really essential to gaining a picture of sort of a snapshot or a running picture of home energy security in the state in question, and with respect to the sort of the health of credit and collections as well. So this list of data points in terms of arrearages, not only by vintage, but a number of accounts by vintage, but dollar amount of arrearages in each of these vintage buckets listed here is very important. We also need, I believe, information on deferred payment agreements or payment plans, and means of determining the effectiveness and the success rate of those plans is also important, since we know deferred payment agreements, when they're reasonable and effective, can really be a great mitigation tool and an alternative to disconnection for non-payment. And actual disconnections and reconnections data is critical, obviously, as well. Duration of disconnection is another metric that tells us, that gives us information about how long people are going without power. The piece I really wanted to emphasize that's on this slide, and that I think is perhaps wasn't discussed in the previous webinar, in my view, it really is important to get to retrieve data points not only from the general residential customers, but also identified low-income customers. And of course, this should be reported in aggregate. We're not talking about reporting on individual customers at all. But if we have number of accounts for both residential and identified low-income customers, we can then compare and contrast to see the extent to which lower-income households really are struggling, and the arrearage, disconnection, and reconnection and payment agreement data points here provide excellent indicators of that. So to conclude here, on the next slide, actually there are just two of them, so I'll hurry up here, but in the last 15 years, I'd say a half a dozen to a dozen states were added to those handful of states that previously had been reporting on credit and collection metrics. But in most states, I would say, that are currently engaged, there really are problems that ideally the new states that haven't gone this route yet will avoid, and that states that have already begun credit and collection data reporting can improve. For most states that are engaged, the set of data points reported really is incomplete. If there's a disconnection metric, perhaps there's not a restoration metric. If there's an arrearage metric, maybe there's not dollar amount associated with arrearages, etc. Some states combine electric and gas utility reporting. which doesn't help us in the design of programs that are geared toward customers of a particular fuel. In a number of states, data is collected, but the public really doesn't have access to it. And to use the data as a public policy tool without public access, it really is of limited usefulness. The frequency of reporting in many cases fails to capture seasonal and other variations. Many states don't separate out identified low-income households from non-low-income households. And then there are some that will report metrics such as disconnections or reconnections, but don't report the number of total accounts. So the user cannot determine what the rate of disconnection or reconnection or what the arrearage rate is. So I think that total account, it's a simple piece that a number of states have missed. So that's all I've got. I wanted to close with reference to a document from, on the last slide, you'll see reference to a document. It's 15 years old now, but just to show that this issue has been around for a while, go ahead and take a look at this document. It really, it brings up the points that have been raised in these last two webinars. And again, this is 15 years old. There was a resolution brought before NASUCA a little bit after this, and an initial resolution was adopted by NASUCA. I forget what year initially, but we also went before NIATA, NARUC, but were unsuccessful in getting a resolution adopted many years ago, right after the distribution of this paper. So anyway, this stuff isn't new, and I'm glad that there is a new set of folks that are interested in these issues and look forward to working together to to advance this agenda. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, John. Really appreciate it. And I'd have one quick question. You mentioned that utilities are reluctant to share data, and I'm wondering if you have seen a change in attitude in recent years as the whole issue about data and who owns the data and who can access the data. We've really shown a spotlight on that because of the vast amounts of data that we're getting with advanced metering. So have you noticed that there's been a little bit of a loosening of the reluctance on the utilities part, or is that one of those things that varies depending on where you are in the country?
I have not yet encountered a situation, including recent attempts to get data in, I won't name the specific states here, but in states that really have nothing right now, there has not been a loosening. I think utilities consistently come forward. The initial argument is that providing this is burdensome and we can't do it. And then when pressed a little bit, I think they're led to acknowledge that it's possible to provide all of these data points, but that something perhaps with the IT system will make it very difficult to do and very expensive to provide. But not to question anybody's straightforwardness or motivations, but my sense is, and having worked on this for years now, is that utilities really, they see it as a prospective PR disaster, that they don't want the world focusing on how many folks they're shutting off for non-payment. That's not something that utilities relish advertising.
Yeah.
So anyway, it's really to try to assuage those fears and go back to what the point of this is, and that is to develop public policy to shield non-low income ratepayers from credit and collection costs, by developing good programs and to improve the home energy security situation of lower income households, if that set of objectives remains in the forefront, some utilities I find over time loosen up on their objections.
All right, thank you, John. And we've actually been discussing in the Northeast about there's many utilities that cross state boundaries. So by having the states work together and go to the utility with the outcomes first and foremost in mind, and then talk about some consistency among data sharing and collection practices, that might be effective. Because there's some variation.
Gold, I think you're spot on. And in fact, in your state of Rhode Island, where the main investor-owned utility, National Grid, also serves customers in Massachusetts. There's a great example. We have National Grid that has been providing these data points in Massachusetts for quite some time, and I think Cindy's going to talk more about this, but what had been reported in Rhode Island was less and more disparate. And by working with what has already been established in Massachusetts with National Grid, hopefully in Rhode Island, what you will end up with will be enhanced relative to what it has been so far.
All right, great. Well, thank you. And Cindy is going to talk about that a little bit more. All right, well, thanks a lot, John. That sets the stage nicely for our next series of discussions. So we will turn now to Commissioner Guzman. Say that.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Commissioner Gold, and thank you, NASUCA and NARUC and NRRI for getting together to discuss this important topic. Some of my slides I'll go through quicker since John mentioned some of the value of having the data, but it's really great to be able to have this conversation. We're actually in the middle of a proceeding discussing how to deal with this issue, largely on the gas and electric side. But I did want to mention I am joined by the Water Division Executive Director, Rami Callan, who's been working on water disconnection issues for some time, and we have also had some fairly recent legislative activity around that also. So happy to answer any questions when it's time on any of those three utility services. Okay, so let me jump into the next slide here. As you know, we've talked about this, the importance of having this data, and certainly it's provided us a way to identify some of our more vulnerable populations. In fact, some of the research that we've done, we utilize to really zone in on communities that maybe have unique circumstances. And as we're going through our proceeding now, we're starting to ask the question about maybe some sort of mitigation measures or intervention measures that may be merited by community level. That's a question we're looking at in particular because some of the zip codes that have some of the customers in some of the zip codes, they rank the top. And when we look at the numbers in various ways, including repeat disconnections. Also, I'll say on the public participation side, we've also used the zip codes to really help identify where to host public workshops. And so we're trying to really have these discussions in the communities where they're impacted most. Communities like here in California that some of you may be familiar with cities of Fresno and San Bernardino, where we continue to see real high levels, and Stockton as well. Okay, so next slide. Next slide here will show us some of the history. You know, you can see Southern California Edison, which is an electric-only utility. Pacific Gas and Electric is both electric and gas. And San Diego Gas and Electric is both electric and gas. And then Southern California Gas is a gas utility. We are able to separate the electric and gas, the combined gas and electric utilities, but just given the time, we are showing you kind of this more aggregate map and graph. And what you'll see is what's not really captured here, what you'll see when you disaggregate is the electric utilities are disconnecting a lot more. And there's a few theories behind that. One of the major theories is that we can do the disconnections remotely. and we can reconnect remotely. Now with the smart meter capability, that facilitates disconnections, which is created a bit of a social question for us. Certainly with the gas side, it's a little more difficult because you physically need to be able to turn off and on. So as you'll see, we've had a problem here, which is that our disconnection rates have been going up. And this led to the passage in 2017 of a Senate Bill 598 by Senator Wessel, which I'll mention a little more in a couple of slides here. So we can move on to the next slide. Some of our data, as I've mentioned, has allowed us to really get a little more focused. This is in between. These are our counties in California and kind of ranking the counties of highest disconnection rates. It's a little bit of a hard graph to see. Happy to get this emailed around and have a little more focus on it. And as you'll see here in California, we have a little bit of a trend towards the northern counties, Mono, Trinity, and Lake. Interesting in some of John's data, which you'll know, we do have some demographic data that matches up, including on race issues there that have a little bit of a correlation. And then, as I mentioned, some of our Central Valley counties, Kern, Fresno, Madera. So this is just to give you a glance, and I know as you're talking about utilities across states, well, I think geographically, you know, this territory is about, depending on which states you include, could be upward of 6 or 7 of those eastern states combined. Okay, so next slide. This is just to give you a little bit of a history. Again, this is on the electric side. We could answer questions on the water side as well, electric and gas side. In 2019, our ratepayer advocate group, our TURN, petitioned the commission to try to address disconnections. And so in February of 2010, we started to direct the utilities to file monthly reports, which they still file, and through our updated proceeding, which I'll talk about here, we included even more granular data that they're reporting on. In 2007, as I mentioned, Senator Wessel's bill, Senate Bill 598, was signed by the governor, and one of the biggest provisions of the bill was directing us to set a target to reduce disconnections by 2024. And as I'm sure you'll appreciate, and I'm sure other legislators do, legislatures do in other states, they didn't give us too much direction beyond that. So we really have had to establish a baseline, and our biggest challenge this year will be setting the goal of reduction. Anyhow, we also are required to do a annual report to the legislature on electric and gas disconnections. And so let's see here. We had, in July of last year, we opened this rulemaking. In September of last year, we had this new information updated. And I'll talk about one decision that's come out of that proceeding. And just as an example, some of the new data that we are requesting includes customers who are on any sort of bill assistance programs, customers who are on payment plans that last 3 or more months, customers who have broken those plans, any customers whose bills are in arrears, as well as amounts of money owed by those customers. Okay, next slide. So I think, and I've also been joined, by the way, by our lead analyst in the Energy Division, who's really been dealing with these data collection issues. But some of the issues, obviously, that have come up are trying to really narrow what our purpose is. And there's obviously a lot of questions we can ask of the utilities. And I will say that, contrary to what I just heard from John and some of his experience, is that, fortunately, we don't have, our biggest issue with the utilities is not in their, is more in their delay than their interest or hesitation in providing this information. And so we really do, our biggest struggle is really focusing in on what we want to prioritize for that data collection and what we want to use it for, obviously. We certainly are always, as in any case, burdened by that balance of keeping customer privacy concerns and allowing us to go as granular as possible to get to that geographic or demographic focus. There are some limitations on different data sets, and so some of the demographic data is not always as uniform as we'd like. May need time or more resources, the utilities, to adapt to provide some of these requested data, but oftentimes, fortunately, some of our own analysts here are able to match up other existing data like census data that can really help us see a fuller picture. We use reporting tables. Let's see. So our analysts pull data from different tables every month to identify these trends. Our staff is doing a lot of that work. And certainly there's always reporting errors or some inconsistencies in the formats that I'm sure you all deal with. Okay. Feel free to jump in, Janelle, if there's anything I missed here. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so as I mentioned, we have a current proceeding. We did set interim rules at the end of last year, and those rules will either be updated or made permanent as we finalize our permanent rules at the end of this year. And some of those include the prohibition of disconnecting the elderly and the medically vulnerable. We're still continuing to define what those definitions are, but for the interim rules, that's including folks on medical baseline, life support, and or above the age of 65. We also instituted a prohibition on disconnections during extreme heat or freezing days. And we also set an interim baseline essentially for the disconnections to the 2017 levels, which, as you know, is a high level given the history from 2010. So the remainder of this year, we'll be continuing to do public workshops, and you'll see the locations there that we did in the past, and we still have some for this year. We'll be having an additional, some are not listed here, but just again, those locations were really picked based on the high propensity of disconnections in those areas. So moving forward, we're really hoping to be targeted, as I said, geographically with potential solutions, but also hopefully some more systemic solutions looking at disconnections and really seeing if we can find answers through the data. And we have been learning from other states and different approaches. And I'll just say one thing that I saw on your list, John, that I think is important, and that's looking at what costs are already being socialized, particularly on the uncollectible side, that the utilities are receiving revenue from all the ratepayers, and really asking ourselves, given that cost is already being socialized, what kind of opportunities that gives us to try to be a little more creative with some of the customers that are repeating in disconnections and are the most vulnerable. So those, I certainly would invite you all to engage in our process if you have some time to really give us suggestions or even dialogue with us as we all attempt to get at this problem and reduce these levels of disconnections. I think that's all the slides I had, so I'm looking forward to some dialogue. And again, we're happy to answer questions, not just in energy, but also in water. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Commissioner. That was fabulous. And we do have a couple questions that have come in. The first question is whether or not energy efficiency contacts are tracked along with disconnect information.
That's a good question. There's a separate branch, but I wonder, in terms of interventions, Janelle, if you have any thoughts on that, please speak up. So I guess the question being, are interventions on these, is the question more around if we're tracking if folks that have been disconnected have received interventions?
I'm guessing that. I know that's something that we talk about in Rhode Island. How can we, it's more about, I guess, integrating services to people who are struggling to pay their bills. And could...
That's a great question, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And We do collect them separately. It'd be an exercise to actually see where the correlation is. So that's, and it is certainly an area we're looking at in terms of targeted measures.
I know we talked about that a lot in the energy office, where we're trying to, figure out how we can, again, best tackle these problems. Another question came in as to, given the increasing use of advanced meters to actually shut off services, are you or should we be tracking duration of the shutoffs? And is that something that is commonly done? Is it a shut off for a few hours? Or
yes, we track the duration.
Track the duration.
We know that in California, more than 90% of disconnections got reconnected within 1 day. So that's high.
Yeah. And just repeat, okay, you guys heard that. And that was a big, it's actually a measure that the utilities say is a reason behind them supporting disconnecting people, actually, is that because their rate of reconnection is so high and they get people to pay, they feel that the tactic of disconnecting sooner rather than later is a good practice. And it really is a kind of philosophical question that they come in looking at the problem differently. They do see it as a good thing because the duration is relatively short, but we don't all agree on that perspective. So we're continuing to work through that. But
one more. So hi, this is Mika Adiye. I'm the Chief of Staff to Commissioner Guzman. And one of the other things that we've tracked is on the gas side, because it's harder to disconnect, it's also harder to reconnect. And there have been challenges in the past with people being disconnected for very long periods of time, like days or weeks even. So that's been a big area of focus for the commission and trying to make sure that the gas utilities are reconnecting people more quickly. So I don't know if that's something that's been seen in New England or in other places, but that's the experience here.
Interesting. Okay, great. Well, there's a couple more questions, but I think I'll leave them till the end so we make sure we get through all of the presentations. Thank you so much. That was terrific. And I'm going to turn it over now to my colleague, Cindy Wilson-Frias.
Okay, so Rhode Island has decided that it's time to update our low-income reporting. So if we go to the next slide, so the first question is, what prompted the need to revise the low-income reporting requirements? And as John noted earlier, Rhode Island has a lot of data, but it's been collected at different points in time and in different places. We do get monthly data reporting on a lot of the areas that people are interested in, but not all of them. We've never had a problem collecting data. I do remember, John, at one of the first times we met many years ago, you asked me how we were able to get as much as we did, and I said we just ask. So we've been very lucky not having to have to fight the utilities for that information. And
may follow up on that later when there's more time, but in reconsidering it, probably should have said it depends on who asks for the data. When the regulator asks, the opposition tends to be a little bit more weak. when the advocates ask, it's sometimes that's when the opposition is greater. And also, I would amend to say that once utilities have been doing this for a while, and they see that the world continues to spin on its axis and doesn't come to a complete screeching halt, then, of course, as is the case in California now, the opposition sort of melts away. So sorry to interrupt, Cindy.
That's fine. I'm good with being interrupted. So we do collect monthly data. We also collect data in other places where related to specific programs. We've collected data during various rate cases. And so what we've realized is while everything's up on our website, it's not that easy to find all the time. So we were looking at how to streamline. We were getting all of these reports in. People weren't having time to look at them or put them together. And so we were already thinking about it. The one thing, before I forget, one of the gaps that John was noting, some of the gaps in the reporting requirements, and one of the things in Rhode Island is about a third of our customer or our residents heat with a non-regulated fuel, such as oil or propane. And so we are a little bit blind to those unregulated entities. And I know we're talking about the regulated ones, but I wanted to point out that gap before I forgot about it. We also had the situation where we had multiple agencies, such as the ratepayer advocate or attorney general, collecting data as well, which at times appeared duplicative, but also seemed simultaneously conflicting. So for example, we would both be asking the same questions and getting different information on a monthly basis. What we realized when sitting down with National Grid is some of it was a lack of consistent definitions and terminology. Some of it was timing differences. They would pull the data for us at the end of the month. They would pull the data for the ratepayer advocate mid-month, just because of the way the questions were initially asked. So we had a lot of snapshot data that did not allow for good analysis of trends. And we had data that was collected for multiple purposes or different purposes. So for example, in a rate case where you're setting an uncollectible factor to embed in rates, you might be looking at the information differently or asking the questions differently than if you're trying to look at collections trends. So the next slide. Last year, we had a rate case with National Grid. National Grid serves 100% of our gas customers in Rhode Island and 87% of our electric customers in Rhode Island. So that's why we're focused on them. They're also our only investor-owned electric and gas utility. And so as a result of this rate case, the PUC approved a new tiered income discount rate whereby low-income customers receive a 25% discount off of the bill, with those entering the rate through certain programs receiving an additional 5% for a total of 30%. This was a significant expansion of the prior discounted rate, which was only off the distribution portion of the bill. It also introduced for the first time a tiered income-based component. So of course, what's the next question in the next rate case? Is it working? Is it working better than the old way? So the PUC directed National Grid, the Division of Public Utilities and Carriers, which is our ratepayer advocate, and the George Wiley Center, which is a very active low-income advocate in Rhode Island, to work with PUC staff to consolidate and develop a set of reporting requirements for existing and new electric and natural gas low-income rates, programs, and discounts upon the conclusion of the rate case. The reporting requirements should inform how low-income rates, programs, and discounts advance the PUC's rate design principles, including the information that will be needed to support future investigation into more dynamic low-income rate design. And at that open meeting decision, the PUC referenced the information sought by the division witness, Roger Colton, who offered that he thought the objective or purpose of offering a low-income discount is for the low-income customer to receive a sustainably payable bill. The problem is much of the information needed for Mr. Colton's analysis was not readily available prior to the rate case, so it needed to be produced during discovery. So now the utility was faced with getting a huge set of data requests from the ratepayer advocate and another set from the commission. This is time-consuming work within a time constraint. And often we found that we were getting what I'll term quick and dirty numbers. We would go back and compare things that looked like similar questions were being asked and get different answers. And so that led to this idea that we needed to have one consistent set of reports so that in the next rate case, we didn't run into that same problem. So on the next slide, I talk a little bit about our process. So as a result of the Commission's directive, staff has held 4 meetings with National Grid, the Division, and the George Wiley Center. John Howitt from NCLC has assisted us in our first meeting. We have another meeting scheduled at the end of June. National Grid has been very cooperative in this process. they have an incentive to both reduce the number of reports that they regularly provide and to provide information outside of a rate case in order to reduce having to recreate that information within that compressed discovery schedule. They also have an incentive to give us the information correctly the first time so that we're not following up with a lot of questions. So we started those meetings with a discussion of what reports we already get and what might be missing. And we do get a lot of information. We've gotten a lot of information over time, but again, some of it wasn't consistent and not all of it seemed to make sense when we started comparing it. So as John said earlier, we decided to start with a Massachusetts report template and then to tailor it to the information Rhode Island might want. We have some different legal requirements and we have some different classifications of customers, not just low income versus non-low income, but we have an elderly classification within our collections rules. We have a seriously ill provision and a handicap provision, to name a few. And as John said, National Grid also operates in Massachusetts, and so they share personnel, they share software systems, and so we thought it would be most efficient for them to start with what they know. We will also be collecting additional information in addition to the things that appear on slide 7 of John's PowerPoint to understand trends among more discrete groups and to see how, if we can determine how the new rate structures are working. So on the next slide, currently, National Grid at the last meeting provided a draft report that the group reviewed. We eliminated some line items that were irrelevant due to a difference in law or regulatory requirements. We've also requested additional information related to unique subcategories of customers that differ from Massachusetts. One thing we noticed is that there is a duration of service disconnection for restored accounts, and we've asked the company to break that out between what we call protected and non-protected customers. We also needed to provide some more specificity to capture the tiered discount. So those are a couple of examples where we have some differences. We've also requested a more technical glossary. The National Grid provided an explanation of the source of the data and what some of the line items meant, but we still had questions. And so we want to make sure that we're getting what we think we're asking for. And so we've asked them to pull together some more specific explanation. So for the next meeting, National Grid will be providing another draft report, and they will be mapping the current reports to the new report to identify any data gaps that might arise in the transition. We don't want to lose the information we have. And we want to make sure that we are able to compare apples to apples where possible. And so once that is finalized, once we have a report that the group thinks is going to capture what we need, we will have to present that report to the commission for approval and then determine the best path forward to eliminate the old reports. So most of those old reports come out of prior commission orders, and so we don't want the utility to be violating old orders, and we also want to make sure that people can find the data if they've been looking at it over time. So on the next slide, I talk about some of the challenges that we identified along the way. One of the biggest things is whether the PUC and the parties were asking the right questions. And that really comes from, as I keep saying, we'd ask questions that we thought were the same, it's very similar to, if not the same as questions asked by a party in the docket, and we would end up with data that looked different. And what we found, and we've also asked questions in the past that the answers we got back didn't really make sense. And one of the places that we stumble the most often is when we ask rate class and we really mean customer class, and vice versa. So the lack of consistent terminology between the regulators and the utility has proven to be a stumbling block. Also, I put down a lack of consistent terminology between advocacy groups and the utility, and between regulators and the advocacy groups, to make sure that we're understanding what the advocacy groups are coming before the commission to ask them for assistance or to consider a position. And then even more concerning or more critical is making sure there's consistent terminology and understanding of the questions between different departments of the utility. And I alluded to this, but during the rate case, the race is on to provide timely responses to data requests. And data requests often somebody gets the data request in, and then they pick who should be working on these to make sure that they're going to meet that deadline. And often what will happen is somebody will get their set of data requests and they will say, what is the quickest way to pull some set of data from the software system to get some legitimate answer? And there won't always be time, is what we're told, to fully vet that to make sure that everybody's doing that the same way. And so we think if we can get a consistent set of terminology, then we'll get better responses and we'll be able to have more faith in the numbers. So one of the concerns that came up during the rate case was a concern that low and moderate income customers may not be fully subscribed to the discount rates or other programs for which they are eligible. And so how do we identify the population of customers eligible for the low income rate? So we talked about census data. And the very first meeting we had with the stakeholders was that there are weaknesses to that. For example, you could have elderly population without a utility bill if they're in a nursing home, for example. College students might not have income, but they're living in a dorm. And so that was one of the conversations we started having. We've put it in the parking lot. We're going to come back to it. And how do you ensure that there are ways to identify these customers? So we talked about enrollment in other income eligible programs, but unfortunately right now there's a lack of really good coordination between those programs. For example, if you go to enroll in SNAP, they may not know to say, hey, you might be eligible for a low income discount on your electric and gas bill. And so those are some things that need to be worked on. The advocacy groups identified the potential of a utility customer service gap. That, for example, when you have a utility that is operating in multiple states, they're operating under a multiple set of rate classes and rules. And so how do you make sure that you're getting the right answer and that customers are getting the right assistance along the way at the outset? And then customer education and outreach, and whether there were gaps there. And so then the question is, why are we doing this? Are we getting the right data to determine whether or not there's a benefit to all customers resulting from the low income rate? And I put cross-subsidy in parentheses. And this is really important because when we're in the rate-making context, we want to make sure that we can justify requiring certain customers to pay more than their cost of being served so that others can pay less. And so can we determine things like if the enrollment in the new low-income rate has resulted in fewer terminations? And if so, can we show that all customers benefit from the fewer terminations? And some examples off the top of my head: more revenues paid, avoidance of termination and restoration fees, and potentially lower term costs in the operation and maintenance category. So the next slide, are we still on track? So now that we've had our meetings and determined what we want this potential streamlined report to look like, or at least what we want to present to the commission, is at the next meeting we are scheduled to review the group's purpose again and make sure we're still on track. And that's what the next bullet point says, and that's just a repeat of what I said earlier. And so the questions we are going to be asking is, at a high level, what is the goal for customers? What information are we looking for in the next rate case? And does this report give us that? And are we collecting the right information? Do we need more? Is there, or does this report have information that is nice to have, but we're not sure what we are going to use it for? One person at one of the meetings said there's a tendency to collect a lot of data, but we should always be asking what we are going to use it for so that we're not wasting effort. And on the next slide, I have performance indicators. So as I noted earlier, there was a concern during the rate case that there was a gap in customer service efficacy. And so there were two items in commission approved settlement, which was increased stability of service through increased enrollment in the low income discount rate. And that's what led to the discussion of how do we identify those eligible customers. And so this is something that will be, the commission determined would be tracked through the next rate case. Then there was a reduction of uncollectible debt. So National Grid has an arrearage management plan. And so the requirement was that they would report enrollment in that plan at the point of potential termination from service, for purpose of developing a baseline and eventually setting an improvement target from this baseline to maintain service to the low-income customer and prevent expansion of uncollectible debt. So in the meantime, National Grid has implemented a personalization tool in its customer service software. And the purpose is for the customer service representatives to ask better questions both at the start of service to get people into the right rate from the outset, and if a call comes into customer service with either a high bill or a collections issue, that the customer service agents are getting the right prompts to offer the best fit arrangements to customers. And I know that payment arrangements is part of it, but during the rate case, we also talked about the offering of energy efficiency programs, because there are a lot of programs that are zero cost to low-income customers. And so what we heard at the last meeting is that this this personalization tool may be putting everybody on a little bit better of a track, and we want to make sure these are still the correct metrics. Because as one of the participants pointed out, more arrearage management plan enrollments suggest the continuation of unmanageable arrearages. But if customers are enrolled in the correct rate up front, and if that rate is manageable, then there should be fewer arrearage management plan enrollments, which could be a measure of success, but not the same measure that we are tracking. And if customers are enrolled in the right rate, and if necessary, the best payment plan, they may be able to still avoid termination without enrollment in the arrearage management plan, again, a measure of success. So we're going to be talking about what the key performance indicators are that we should be thinking about. And so on the last slide, once we have a final draft in place, we'll present the report to the Commission for approval and also make recommendations for the Commission to approve elimination of reports that would become duplicative. We will likely continue the stakeholder meetings to monitor and address any gaps that we may find in reporting. But the biggest challenges I think that we've seen in achieving the reporting of a consistent set of data seems to be developing consistent terminology, the ability to extract the same data from software systems, challenges of unique state laws, and what are the goals of the entity requiring the reports.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Cindy. That's a lot of information. And I want to remind folks that we will be putting the presentations and information on all of the webinars up on our website. So some of these presentations are quite information rich, and you can go back and review, and I'm sure the presenters will be happy to take questions. And we do have some questions that have come in, but I want to make sure that we get to all of our panelists. So I'm going to turn it over now to Mary Grant, who is going to talk about some of these challenges from the water perspective. Take it away, Mary.
Thank you, Commissioner Gold. Good afternoon. So I'm Mary Grant, the Public Water for All Campaign Director at Food and Water Watch. Food and Water Watch, we're a national environmental organization. We advocate on a range of issues, from food safety inspections to climate change. I work with our organizers on campaigns to support safe and affordable public water for all. So you can advance to our overview slide. So today I just want to make a case for utility commissions to also collect and publish data about water service disconnections. I'll begin with some background about why we need to start talking more about water affordability. Then I'll go over some findings from our National Water Shutoff Survey and conclude with some recommendations. So you can advance to the background slide about aging infrastructure. So water affordability has become a growing issue in the country. Just as was discussed in the last webinar about the gas and power industry, a primary driver of growing water rates is a real, genuine need to invest and improve our infrastructure. In total, EPA estimates that our water systems need $744 billion over the next 20 years. The American Water Works Association put the figure even higher, $1 trillion. On the next slide, you can see how, at the same time, federal support for water infrastructure has fallen dramatically. Since peaking in 1977, peaked in 1977, federal funding has been cut by 74% in real dollars. On a per capita basis, that is an 82% drop. So on the next slide, you can see that as a result, local utilities are having to raise water prices on their customers. And for a growing number of people, water bills are simply beyond their ability to pay. This is particularly true for people living on fixed income, like seniors and people on disability. One study from Michigan State University professor Elizabeth Mack painted a really stark picture. They found that 1 in 3 households nationwide may be unable to afford their water bills by this year, 2019. While there are different metrics for assessing water affordability, we're already seeing a water affordability crisis hit cities like Detroit and Baltimore. So it is a simple reality that unaffordable bills are often unpaid bills, and the common collection method for unpaid water bills, like with other utilities, is shutting off water service. On the next slide, here is just a list of ways that water shutoffs can be dangerous. Water is a basic necessity for life. No matter the season, no matter your medical history, everyone needs water, and water shutoffs pose real threats to public health. Without running water, you can't flush toilets or bathe. Imagine being unable to wash your hands after changing a dirty diaper. Imagine being a senior living in a home with unflushed toilets. Water shutoffs have forced people to move, and in some places, children have been taken away from caregivers under child protection laws because of no running water in the home. So on the next slide, you can see that we launched a national water shutoff report because despite these far-reaching consequences, there's no national database. No one tracks and collects this information in a systematic manner across the country. There's actually very little information about how common water shutoffs are. So that's why we wanted to set out to provide just a national snapshot of the issue. So we filed information requests to the 2 largest water utilities in each state to find out how many households were shut off for non-payment at least once during the calendar year 2016. We found that the average utility disconnected 5% of its residential customers for non-payment that year. There was great variation. Some utilities shut off no one, while others disconnected as many as 1 in 5 homes. You can see our full report and data set at the link online there. So extrapolating that average disconnection rate, we estimate that 15 million people in the country had a water shutoff in 2016. You can go to the next slide. And then on the next slide, you can see a map of water shutoffs. So these are the water shutoff rates sized. The 10 cities with the highest shutoff rates are labeled. Notably, some cities had no disconnections, including Eau Claire, Wisconsin, Leominster, Massachusetts, and Champaign, Vermont. So on the next slide, we also looked at factors that may be driving shutoffs to see if there's any trends. As a measure of affordability, we looked at water bill burdens. That is the total water and sewer costs of a typical household as a portion of income for the poorest fifth of households. These water bill burdens exceeded 9% in cities like New Orleans and Detroit. These high water burdens were largely driven by wastewater costs, which is important to note because we're seeing more and more regulated private companies acquire wastewater systems. So, particularly where they're already providing drinking water. I also want to note that the total annual water and sewer bill in Detroit, which had the highest water bill burden by far, but the water and sewer bill was only about $1,000 a year. That's nearly the same as the drinking water only bill for the biggest regulated water company in Pennsylvania. So even if your regulated water utilities don't provide wastewater service, low-income households may still have high water bill burdens. On the next slide are the water bill burdens in the cities with the fewest water shutoffs. What is fairly clear is that water burdens alone don't explain why some cities have more shutoffs than others. Cities like Eugene have fairly high water burdens, but very few water shutoffs comparably. So on the next slide, you can see how policies and procedures seem to help prevent water shutoffs. So I don't want to spend too long going over these very hyper-local details, but I do want to highlight one factor. The cities with high shutoff rates but low water burdens gave the least amount of time to pay a bill prior to shutoff. In Springdale, Arkansas, by ordinance, a household could experience a water shutoff in as little as 3 weeks from when the bill was mailed, when the mailing date to the household. So these policies and procedures do seem to have a big impact on disconnection rates. So on the next slide, you can see at the other end, here are some of the policies of the cities with the fewest shutoffs. Eugene, as I noted earlier, has a relatively high water burden, but few shutoffs. The city provides the most assistance. It's only up to $200 a year, which wasn't included in the burden calculation. It also has a shutoff moratorium during hot and freezing weather. A 2018 survey by the American Water Works Association found that only 25% of the surveyed utilities had actual low-income assistance programs. Another 23% of water systems offered payment plans or referred people to nonprofits, but more than half didn't even do that. Another study found that most of the existing few low-income assistance plans that are available are small with limited capacity and ability to meet the needs of low-income households. Many are funded with voluntary contributions and not dedicated revenue. So on the next slide, our survey focused on public, mostly unregulated utilities because we had a serious problem getting any information from regulated private water systems. Only one provided us data, Suez in Idaho, which had a shutoff rate which is about average, about 4%. We can request this data from public entities through state open records laws, but private companies are not subject to those transparency laws. Unlike John, I am naming the names of utilities that did not respond to us. So you can see the full list there of the utilities that did not respond to us. So on the next page, I want to just highlight that they don't even seem to provide this data to federal agencies. GAO did not receive data from American Water, the largest private water utility in the US, for its survey of water infrastructure needs in cities with declining populations. The survey was intended to inform the federal government about programs and policies that could help cities address their water needs, and they didn't receive the data from the regulated private water systems. So on the next slide, that's why I want to strongly encourage utility commissions to require regulated water companies to track and report information about water shutoffs, and then to publish that online in a manner that is easily accessible for the public. As the commissioner from California noted, I also would want to emphasize that geographic data can be very useful. And in addition, for water systems, it's important to note vacancy status. One of the things we've heard from cities like Detroit is that a lot of the water shutoffs, Detroit had tens of thousands of water shutoffs a year in 2014. And their water system said that a lot of those were vacant properties. It's always a question for advocates, are they vacant before or after the water shutoff? So noticing vacancy status, especially as more water systems are adopting smarter meters that can track water usage over time, you can see the vacancy status more easily. Detroit provides one model about they've actually started looking at vacancy status of these properties are being disconnected. Also, the time between the disconnection and the service restoration is really important. But I want to return to geographic data. So on the next slide, in Baltimore, we've been able to get pretty robust data about where water shutoffs have occurred. The same has been true for a lot of cities like Detroit and Chicago. You're able to get really detailed, granular data about where these shutoffs are occurring. So in Baltimore, we work with legal aid organizations that host legal clinics to connect low-income households with assistance. we can map water shutoffs to help inform the location of these clinics. And as a note, Baltimore has had no shutoffs since 2017. In Detroit, grassroots organizations also use maps to help with water distribution sites and policy advocacy. Detroit has had mass water shutoffs for years. And so there's all these grassroots organizations that try to distribute bottled water through donations. And they use the maps of the shutoffs to help with distribution sites. And I'm encouraged to hear how the California PUC is using geographic data to host workshops too. I think that's an important thing to do, is looking at where people are being affected and bringing solutions and assistance to those neighborhoods. With the geographic data, you can also open up a range of analysis by overlapping with census information to identify more socioeconomic factors. The American Public Media did this for the Great Lakes region recently. Earlier this year, they released a big report about water disconnections in the Great Lakes. And it helped inform the policy debate, particularly in Chicago. They found that communities of color were disproportionately impacted by water shutoffs. And one of the first actions of the new mayor of Chicago, Mayor Lightfoot, was to impose a water shutoff moratorium while directing the water department to look at affordability issues. So on the next slide, I want to pose a question. Can you apply best practices you learn from the gas and electricity sector to the water sector? Some states do that already. For example, Massachusetts applies many of the same safety nets for gas and electricity service to the regulated water industry. It has shutoff protections for homes with people with serious illnesses, elderly members, and families with infants. I would encourage commissions to similarly expand these existing protections and safety nets to customers of regulated water utilities, if they have not done so already. We are seeing some mergers between these sectors. Aqua America, a regulated water company, is buying People's Gas, a regulated gas company. Eversource, a regulated gas and electric company, just bought Aquarian Water, a regulated water company. So now may be a good time to extend and expand these protections and also data collection procedures. So I recognize that there are differences between the industries that could make it challenging. The water industry is highly fragmented. There are tens of thousands of water systems across the country. Drinking water is regulated in more states than wastewater. The services have different rate divisions. There's no federal low-income assistance program for water or sewer service. And multifamily housing can pose a particular challenge. So on the next slide, I want to end by highlighting this last point. I find it to be a particular injustice that across the country, renters are having their water shut off through no fault of their own. Just because their landlord fails to pay their water bill, the renters increasingly pay separately for water, while they are up to date on those water charges as well as their rent, and they could still experience a water shutoff. This highlighted cases from a regulated utility in Missouri from last fall, but it is a common problem and most don't make the news. Submetering can be cost prohibitive for water services. So outside of that, I want to ask, are there any best practices from the gas and electricity sector to help prevent this? I expect that this is going to continue to be a big problem as water costs rise and absence of regulation to address the tenant-related issues. So, thank you.
Mary, that was terrific. Thank you so much. Many, many provocative questions there. And we are starting to run short on time, but we did get a clarifying question that came in. The question is for you, Mary. What happened in Baltimore to stop the shutoffs after 2016? Did you mean that the shutoffs stopped? And if yes, can you explain why?
Sure. Yes, they did stop. Baltimore has had no shutoffs since 2016 because they were migrating their billing system to a smart billing system.
Huh,
so they wanted to stop shutoffs during the billing system migration.
Oh,
and there's also been active campaigns around water affordability in the city, trying to get the city to adopt an affordability program. But the city's reasoning for putting a pause on shutoffs is because the billing system was being migrated and they were worried about errors in that transition.
Yeah, okay. All right, great. Thank you. Well, I think I will ask Cindy, the commissioner from California, and John to comment on the challenges with respect to water affordability and whether or not we can take some of the lessons learned and the work that's ongoing on the electric and gas side of the house as relatively brief answers on your perspectives on that issue. And maybe start with you, John, because you have a broad national perspective.
Sure, thanks. And wow, Mary, what a presentation. That was that was good stuff, if not very, very troubling. But it just is a matter of fact that home energy affordability has been sort of a public policy focus for much longer than water affordability and security has. And we have learned a lot on the electric and gas sides with respect to program design, data collection and reporting, program administration. So I think with respect to your questions and is there transferability, of course there will be differences, particularly when you get into these, all these tiny water systems that many of which are so troubled, as you mentioned. But yes, the short answer is yes. I think there is transferability, and we at NCLC would certainly look forward to working with you on trying to look for that overlap and make good use of it.
Great, thank you, John. And I know it is an interest of growing concern in Rhode Island and other places in New England. Commissioner Guzman, how about California?
Thank you, Commissioner Gold. Yeah, I would just add that fragmentation is definitely here in California. We have over 7,000 different types of water districts, largely public. And I know that Mary is very familiar with California as well, and the State Water Resources Control Board is really the lead, and we are more the supplement on the private side with our limited but still significant water utilities. I also wanted to just share that yesterday there was a budget deal here in California, and it did include over $100 million annually for 10 years towards the issue of drinking water for communities that lack safe drinking water. So I think this is going to be a new opportunity for us to work in collaboration with the State Water Board to look for opportunities for everything to really optimize the use of that funding, potentially consolidation, both actual and non-physical, but organizational. And looking at some of what you've mentioned, we were just kind of talking as you were presenting about some of the data that we are not collecting on the water side, such as duration and some of the other pieces. But Director Collin, if you have other reflections.
Yeah, this is Rami Kalan with the Public Utilities Commission here in California. So in California, we passed a bill last year, SB 998, which will require us, all water utilities, to track disconnects, as well as provide a 60-day period before anybody's shut off. So we, from the legislative side, we've made some progress. And this bill was largely modeled off of rules that the Public Utilities Commission already had in place for its investor-owned utilities. So we are happy to see that happen. One of the best practices that we need to consider is to provide some exemptions for medical and the elderly, which we don't have on the water side. We only have it for waste of water, but we can do better in that regard.
Great, that's very helpful. Thank you. And this is obviously, we could have another series of webinars on water alone. So I just have time for a couple more quick questions. Here's a fast one for Cindy. One of our audience members asked whether you were able to share the Massachusetts template, your revised template, and your technical glossary.
So the Massachusetts template I do have, and I've got a draft one with the Rhode Island information. I could provide the technical glossary. There's caveats, of course. This is all a work in progress. These are drafts. And what I would be providing is something that during the last meeting we had made changes to, so it wouldn't be the sort of, it's still very much a work in progress. So I just, with that caveat.
Okay, great. Thank you, Cindy. And this might be one of the recommendations, some standardized terminology that would emerge from this webinar series. And finally, we have a question that's kind of a good lead into our next webinar. The question is, this is to anyone, in addition to energy efficiency services, there are a range of other services that could be helpful to people who struggle to pay utility bills. Is there an effort to increase communications, for example, high bill alerts? Is there an effort to make it easier to pay, e.g. more payment locations? Is there an effort to encourage more frequent payments, things like weekly payments or trying to align payments with lifestyle and when people are paid? And finally, is there an effort to create options for stable bills with no true-ups for changes in usage? For example, a utility could charge a premium for the hedge against changes in weather. So that's kind of a series of new ideas that the audience member is asking about.
I can take part of that. I think some of it depends on our utility. So we have we have two small municipal utilities who very often do enter into payment plans on a weekly basis or can provide some personalized service that the larger utility doesn't. And in fact, the PUC's terminations, collections rules addresses that ability of the utility to be able to take those sorts of things into account. Those are the ones that I remember getting talked about.
That's good. And California, any additional comments?
Well, we have had some workshops where we've put on the table some really ambitious approaches, and we had actually the public water system of Pennsylvania came out and shared a model that they use for ability to pay. And they have targeted, I think it was something like 20,000 customers, the lowest targeted amount of customers. And it's a obviously very ambitious approach to not base it on usage. And they had really just an approach based on the ability to pay based on their income. That's something that we're asking a question about here. Is there a targeted population where we see this recurring high energy burden, recurring disconnections, and other factors that maybe we just need a whole new approach? The other thing that's been proposed that we're looking at is a different type of arrearage management, where in some cases the debt is so large, if there could be a program set up where customers are, again, based on their ability to pay, making payments, and then us allowing for a debt forgiveness component. And this again comes from other sectors and in where we've seen a debt forgiveness model approach. And this is related to an earlier point I made with us looking at how it relates to the uncollectibles that utilities are already kind of recovered from. And so giving us some flexibility to hopefully provide for some debt forgiveness of the most egregious cases.
Excellent. Well, thank you. And that is actually a really good lead-in to our next webinar, where we are going to be looking more closely at some of the emerging new best practices that we're learning are effective in different parts of the country. So at this point, I want to thank all of the panelists for taking the time to share their expertise with us and with the audience. We will be putting, as I said, all the materials up on the NRRI website so that we can, study them and think about recommendations at the November NARUC meeting. That's where we're headed. Let's see. Our next webinar, our third webinar in the series, will be on August 7th. And just a second, I can't read this. Catherine, do you want to take over and talk about the robocall? Because I can't.
Yeah, absolutely. So NRRI's next webinar, we wanted to alert you to this, will be on Wednesday, July 17th. And it's going to focus on robocalls and looking at can we stop them. And so our telecom principal researcher, Sherry Lichtenberg, has gathered a great group of panelists together from the industry in different fields, and we'll be discussing this question in further detail. We know it's relevant to most people's lives if you're on the phone these days, and so we look forward to that. With that, I'd like to say thank you so much to Commissioner Gold and all of our panelists. That you've done a really wonderful job at illuminating these topics this afternoon. And we look forward to exploring these topics in the next 2 upcoming webinars for it. So with that, thank you and have a good afternoon.
Thanks so much, Catherine, and thanks to NASUCA and to NARUC and to NRRI.
Thanks, folks.
Bye, everyone.